Is Colin and Penelope's romance better in the book or the show?
We're a book club.
I know that. How stupid do you think I am?
Hi, I'm LadyJenevia, and on my channel I like to talk about entertainment media. I did a video sharing some of the bits from the book that grabbed my attention when reading Romancing Mr. Bridgerton for the first time. I could not share everything that I had screenshot, of course, because I am in fact still under a review embargo for part 2 of season 3, but I decided to circle back to the book for a couple of reasons. I've been doing some polls on my community tab asking viewers whether they prefer the book or the show version of some of the major moments of Colin and Penelope's romantic relationship. Depending on which moment the poll is asking about, some of those polls have gone in the direction of the book, and others they have gone for the show. But also, depending on which poll it was, anywhere between about 30 to 40% of the people voting have self-identified as not having read the book at all. Therefore, it seemed like a good enough reason to put together a video going through each of these major milestones and explain some of the differences between the two, and perhaps whether or not I have an opinion about preferring one version over the other, I can share that as well. Some of these things I have talked about in other Bridgerton season 3 videos, but since there is always that possibility that a Bridgerton video I post will be the first video that someone sees of me, I'm just going to compile all of them together in one place. Plus, we are all finding ways to pass the time before part 2 comes out, and some of us will no longer be under embargo.
I'm down. I've got the 411.
Some people are waiting to see the episodes, and some of us are waiting to finally be let loose to share all opinions instead of having to keep quiet about very large opinions that they would have absolutely shared ages ago if the show hadn't opted for the completely terrible half-and-half review embargo format. Before we get into each section though, I want to remind everyone that donation links for Palestine are in this video's description box. I know I keep saying it in every video that I post, but people still need help, as do the animals being looked after by the Palestinian animal shelters that I've listed on the places to donate. So there we have it. You can also stream HIND'S HALL by MACKLEMORE if you don't have the disposable income to make a direct donation to the links that I've compiled. There are 5 major relationship moments I'm going to revisit in this video. The first one is, of course, the meet cute.
Well, this was some meet cute.
Romancing Mr. Bridgerton opens with a prologue of how Colin and Penelope first met. On the 6th of April, in the year 1812, precisely 2 days before her 16th birthday, Penelope Featherington fell in love. It was, in a word, thrilling. The world shook. Her heart leaped. The moment was breathtaking, and she was able to tell herself with some satisfaction the man in question, one Colin Bridgerton, felt precisely the same way. Oh, not the love part. He certainly didn't fall in love with her in 1812, and not in 1813, 1814, 1815, or, oh blast, not in all the years from 1816 to 1822 either, and certainly not in 1823 when he was out of the country the whole time anyway. But his earth shook, his heart leaped, and Penelope knew without a shadow of a doubt that his breath was taken away as well, for a good 10 seconds. Falling off a horse tended to do that to a man. It happened thus. She'd been out for a walk in Hyde Park with her mother and 2 older sisters when she felt a thunderous rumbling under her feet. See above the bit about the earth shaking. Her mother wasn't paying much attention to her. Her mother rarely did. So Penelope slipped away for a moment to see what was about. The rest of the Featheringtons were in rapt conversation with Viscountess Bridgerton and her daughter Daphne, who had just begun her 2nd season in London, so they were pretending to ignore the rumbling. The Bridgertons were an important family indeed, and conversations with them were not to be ignored. As Penelope skirted around the edge of a particularly fat-trunked tree, she saw 2 riders coming her way, galloping along hell for leather, or whatever expression people like to use for fools on horseback who care not for their safety and well-being. Penelope felt her heart quicken. It would have been difficult to maintain a sedate pulse as a witness to such excitement, and besides, this allowed her to say that her heart leaped when she fell in love. Then, in one of those inexplicable quirks of fate, the wind picked up quite suddenly and lifted her bonnet, which, much to her mother's chagrin, she had not tied properly since the ribbon chafed under her chin, straight into the air and splat! Right onto the face of one of the riders. Penelope gasped. taking her breath away. And then the man fell off his horse, landing most inelegantly in a nearby mud puddle. She rushed forward, quite without thinking, squealing something that was meant to inquire after his welfare, but that she suspected came out as nothing more than a strangled shriek. He would, of course, be furious with her, since she'd effectively knocked him off his horse and covered him with mud, two things guaranteed to put any gentleman in the foulest of moods. But when he finally rose to his feet, brushing off whatever mud could be dislodged from his clothing, he didn't lash out at her. He didn't give her a stinging set-down. He didn't yell. He didn't even glare. He laughed. He laughed. Penelope hadn't much experience with the laughter of men, and what little she had known had not been kind. But this man's eyes, a rather intense shade of green, were filled with mirth as he wiped a rather embarrassingly placed spot of mud off his cheek and said, "Well, that wasn't very well done of me, was it?" And in that moment, Penelope fell in love. When she found her voice, which she was pained to note, was a good 3 seconds after a person of any intelligence would have replied, she said, "Oh no, it is I who should apologize. My bonnet came right off my head," and she stopped talking when she realized he hadn't actually apologized, so there was little point in contradicting him. "It was no trouble," he said, giving her a somewhat amused smile. Oh, good day, Daphne. Didn't know you were in the park." Penelope whirled around to find herself facing Daphne Bridgerton, standing next to her mother, who promptly hissed, "What have you done, Penelope Featherington?" And Penelope couldn't even answer with her stock, nothing, because in truth the accident was completely her fault, and she just made a fool of herself in front of what was obviously, judging from the expression on her mother's face, a very eligible bachelor indeed. Not that her mother would have thought that she had a chance with him, but Mrs. Featherington held high matrimonial hopes for her older girls. Besides, Penelope wasn't even out in society yet. But if Mrs. Featherington intended to scold her any further, she was unable to do so, because that would have required that she remove her attention from the all-important Bridgertons, whose ranks, Penelope was quickly figuring out, included the man presently covered in mud. "I hope your son isn't injured," Mrs. Featherington said to Lady Bridgerton. "Right as rain," Colin interjected, making an expert sidestep before Lady Bridgerton could maul him with motherly concern. Introductions were made, but the rest of the conversation was unimportant, mostly because Colin quickly and accurately sized up Mrs. Featherington as a matchmaking mama. Penelope was not at all surprised when he beat a hasty retreat, but the damage had already been done. Penelope had discovered a reason to dream. If you're watching this video, I'm sure you are already well aware of the fact that the show did nothing to show this meet cute, apart from having the present-day Colin and Penelope talking about how they first met.
Do you remember when we first met? I was riding my horse, minding my own business, when I was assaulted by a devilishly yellow head covering.
It was not my fault. The wind blew it clean off my head.
Oh, wind or not, you certainly seemed pleased when I landed in the mud.
I apologise.
Yes, and you were so very charming about it, teasing me mercilessly, in fact.
It should also surprise absolutely no one that I prefer the book Meet Cute. I don't think it even remotely counts as a meet cute the way they included it, barely, in the show. If I had read the book before watching season 3, I would have absolutely been expecting to see this scene played out in live action, and I would have probably been annoyed that it ultimately wasn't. You had the budget to add all these extra characters and storylines that no one asked for, but you couldn't find a way to include this. Now, I asked for season 3 press screeners to watch Colin and Penelope's love story first and foremost, and you didn't even show me the meet cute? So when Bridgerton fans are making their edits that montage the meet cutes of Simon and Daphne crashing into one another, and Kate and Anthony riding their horses, and John and Francesca standing with each other in silence, you're just going to have Colin and Penelope exposition dumping? Now that hardly seems fair. If season 3 is a Paulin season, well then let me see the Paulin meet cute. And for the people who were there for the Patreon watch party that I did for this episode, and you were asking how they would have done this stunt of having a young Colin falling off a horse, great question. There are a number of ways that you could do that. Depending on the age of the character, you might have either a man or a woman that is shorter in stature do the actual falling part of the stunt, presumably falling onto a safety mat, and then the actual actor who is playing young Colin could just do a shot of them falling into a puddle from a distance of maybe about this much, where they're already fairly close to the ground. And as an actor, you act like you fell from much higher up, and it's a collaborative effort from the stunt coordinator, the director, stunt performer, and the actor to conceive of and perform and capture all the moving parts needed for the editor to put it all together so that we can hopefully get a convincing moment of action where Colin Bridgerton is falling off his horse. Then again, the filmmaking of the balloon going awry was dodgy, to say the least.
Enough is enough.
Honestly, they could have done away with the entire balloon thing and just done the flashback instead. The balloon wasn't giving what needed to be given. Save the money you spent on this balloon and let me see a well-executed meet cute instead. But for each of these moments, you can share in the comments which version you prefer. I know that I did the polls already for people to vote in, but when I post a new Bridgerton video, as I've said, there are usually a couple of people coming in and commenting saying it's the first video of mine that they've seen, so you might have missed those polls when they were posted, so you can share your takes now. The next major moment I'm comparing is the infamous "I would never marry Penelope" moment. It wouldn't be fair to marry someone when she was still so desperately in love with Colin, and maybe in the far reaches of her mind, in the farthest back corner, tucked away behind the French verb conjugations she'd never mastered and the arithmetic she never used, she still held out a tiny shred of hope. Until that day. Even now, 7 years later, she still referred to it as that day. She'd gone to the Bridgerton household, as she frequently did, to take tea with Eloise and her mother and sisters. It was right before Eloise's brother Benedict had married Sophie, only he didn't know who she really was, and, well, that didn't signify, except that it may have been the one truly great secret in the last decade that Lady Whistledown had never managed to unearth. Anyway, she was walking through the front hall, listening to her feet tap along the marble tile as she saw herself out. She was adjusting her pelisse and preparing to walk the short distance to her own home, just around the corner, really, when she heard voices. Male Bridgerton voices. It was the three elder Bridgerton brothers, Anthony, Benedict, and Colin. They were having one of those conversations that men have, the kind in which they grumble a lot and poke fun at each other. Penelope had always liked to watch the Bridgertons interact in this manner. They were such a family. Penelope could see them through the open front door, but she couldn't hear what they were saying until she'd reached the threshold. And in a testament to the bad timing that had plagued her throughout her life, the first voice she heard was Colin's, and the words were not kind. "And I am certainly not going to marry Penelope Featherington." Oh! The words slipped over her lips before she could even think, the squeal of it piercing the air like an off-key whistle. The three Bridgerton men turned to face her with identical horrified faces, and Penelope knew that she had just entered into what would certainly be the most awful 5 minutes of her life. She said nothing for what seemed like an eternity, and then, finally, with a dignity she never dreamed she possessed, she looked straight at Colin and said, "I never asked you to marry me." His cheeks went from pink to red. He opened his mouth, but not a sound came out. It was, Penelope thought with wry satisfaction, probably the only time in his life he'd ever been at a loss for words. "And I never..." She swallowed convulsively. "I never said to anyone that I wanted you to ask me." "Penelope," Colin finally managed. "I'm so sorry." "You have nothing to apologize for," she said. "No," he insisted. "I do. I hurt your feelings and you didn't know I was there. But nevertheless, you are not going to marry me," she said, her voice sounding very strange and hollow to her ears. "There is nothing wrong with that. I am not going to marry your brother Benedict." Benedict had clearly been trying not to look, but he snapped to attention at that. Penelope fisted her hands at her sides. "It doesn't hurt his feelings when I announce that I am not going to marry him." She turned to Benedict, forcing her eyes directly on his. "Does it, Mr. Bridgerton?" "Of course not," Benedict answered quickly. "It's settled then," she said tightly, amazed that, for once, exactly the right words were coming out of her mouth. "No feelings were hurt? Now then, if you will excuse me, gentlemen, I should like to go home." The three gentlemen immediately stood back to let her pass, and she would have made a clean escape, except that Colin suddenly blurted out, "Don't you have a maid?" She shook her head. "I live just around the corner." "I know, but I'll escort you," Anthony said smoothly. "That's really not necessary, my lord. Humor me," he said in a tone that told her quite clearly she hadn't any choice in the matter. She nodded, and the two of them took off down the street. After they had passed about 3 houses, Anthony said in a strangely respectful voice, "He didn't know you were there." Penelope felt her lips tighten at the corners, not out of anger, just out of a weary sense of resignation. "I know," she replied. "He's not the sort to be cruel. I expect your mother has been hounding him to get married." Anthony nodded. Lady Bridgerton's intentions to see each and every one of her 8 offspring happily married were legendary. "She likes me," Penelope said. "Your mother, that is. She can't see beyond that, I'm afraid. But the truth is, it doesn't matter so much if she likes Colin's bride." "Well, I wouldn't say that," Anthony mused, sounding not so much like a highly feared and respected viscount, and rather more like a well-behaved son. "I shouldn't like to be married to someone my mother didn't like." He shook his head in a gesture of great awe and respect. "She's a force of nature." "Your mother or your wife?" He considered that for about half a second. "Both." They walked for a few moments, and then Penelope blurted out, "Colin should go away." Anthony eyed her curiously. "I beg your pardon?" He should go away, travel. He's not ready to marry, and your mother won't be able to restrain herself from pressuring him. She means well. Penelope bit her lip in horror. She hoped the Viscount didn't think she was actually criticizing Lady Bridgerton. As far as she was concerned, there was no greater lady in England. My mother always means well, Antony said with an indulgent smile. But maybe you're right. Perhaps he should get away. Colin does enjoy travel, although he did just return from Wales. Did he? Penelope murmured politely, as if she didn't know perfectly well that he'd been in Wales. Here we are, he said as he nodded his reply. This is your house, is it not? Yes. Thank you for accompanying me home. It was my pleasure, I assure you. Penelope watched as he left, then she went inside and cried. Now, I did share a fair bit of that excerpt in my other video about the book, but I extended it this time to include the bit about Antony walking Penelope home after this debacle, and the fact that Penelope is the one who encourages this whole traveling Colin era. As I said in my other video, I significantly prefer the version of this scene in the book over how it was done on the show. For one, he was talking to his older brothers at home, not to eligible men in the ton at a public place like a ball. There was a real missed opportunity here, the way the show handled things and the way we've seen things play out in part 1, as well as the seasons leading up to Pauline's turn to be the main couple. There was a lack of effective communication to the audience that the Bridgerton family already sees Penelope as being part of their family. I really liked the way the book kept emphasizing that from both Penelope and Colin's point of view. If you go back through the show and the episodes that have been aired thus far, if you really squint and go through things with a fine-tooth comb, I suppose you can find smaller details that could suggest this, but I don't think this is a point you should be sharing with subtlety. It's an important detail that needs to be made abundantly clear to the audience, not all of whom will have read the book. Simon taught Daphne how to take care of business late at night when she's alone.
And eventually you reach the pinnacle, or at least...
Antony Bridgerton sniffed Kate Sharma in public when they were supposed to be playing it cool. I don't think any of us are here to see subtlety when it comes to the romantic connection between the main couple of each season of the show. Colin Bridgerton fell off a horse into a mud puddle and laughed it off, and Penelope Featherington immediately fell in love. You fell first, but I fell harder. Oh, that would have been a cute slogan for Pauline's love story. Now, to be fair to the show, one of the reasons they do have to make some alterations to the material from book to screen is that they cannot as easily do a time jump to make it more closely match the book canon. Penelope is supposed to be 28 and Colin 33 in their book. Penelope is supposed to be resigned to being a spinster by that point, but the show tends to play things where each season of the show is a new season of the Ton, without skipping ahead any years. Having said that though, I think they could have just as easily kept this I would never marry Penelope moment at the Bridgerton house. Well, one of them anyway.
Death.
Have Colin be saying it to his older brothers and let Penelope stand up for herself immediately in the moment, and have Colin be properly, effectively remorseful and embarrassed by what he said. All of that exactly as it was in the book. I don't like the apology scene in the show. It was way better in the book. The way that it's written, he feels deeply mortified at being caught saying that. He even says out loud to her, I hurt your feelings. And even though I do stand by the older video essay I made where I said that you do need to have some sort of rift to jumpstart a Paul and love story, something to make Penelope no longer see Colin as an option, and so that she will be able to start speaking to him more honestly, far outside the confines of the Ton social norms, because that's how every main pairing is on Netflix's Bridgerton. The show could have just as easily achieved that by doing this exchange more like how it was done in the book. You have it happen at a Bridgerton house, have Colin be speaking to his older brothers, have him immediately apologize and be mortified at having been caught saying that, and moreover, play the scene in such a way where we can actually understand Colin's point of view. This was another way that the show did Colin dirty. In the book, you get to revisit that scene from Colin's perspective so that you can understand what led him to saying that in the first place. Colin felt like hell all day. His hand hurt like the devil, despite the brandy he'd sloshed both on his skin and into his mouth. The estate agent who'd handled the lease for the snug little terrace house he'd found in Bloomsbury had informed him that the previous tenant was having difficulties, and Colin wouldn't be able to move in today as planned. Would next week be acceptable? And to top it off, he suspected that he might have done irreparable harm to his friendship with Penelope, which made him feel worst of all since A, he rather valued his friendship with Penelope, and B, he hadn't realized how much he valued his friendship with Penelope, which C, made him feel slightly panicked. Penelope was a constant in his life, his sister's friend, the one who was always at the fringes of the party. nearby but not truly a part of things. But the world seemed to be shifting. He'd only been back in England for a fortnight, but already Penelope had changed. Or maybe he'd changed. Or maybe she hadn't changed, but the way he saw her had changed. She mattered. He didn't know how else to put it. And after 10 years of her just being there, it was rather bizarre for her to matter quite so much. He didn't like that they'd parted ways that afternoon on such awkward terms. He couldn't remember feeling awkward with Penelope, ever. No, that wasn't true. There was that time, dear God, how many years ago was it? 6? 7? His mother had been pestering him about getting married, which was nothing new, except this time she'd suggested Penelope as a potential bride, which was new, and Colin just hadn't been in the mood to deal with his mother's matchmaking in his usual manner, which was to tease her back. And then she just hadn't stopped. She'd talked about Penelope all day and night, it seemed, until Colin finally fled the country. Nothing drastic, just a short jaunt to Wales. But really, what had his mother been thinking? When he'd returned, his mother had wanted to speak with him, of course. Except this time, it had been because his sister Daphne was with child again, and she had wanted to make a family announcement. But how was he to have known that? So he had not been looking forward to the visit, since he was sure it would involve a great deal of completely unveiled hints about marriage. Then he had run into his brothers, and they'd started tormenting him about the very same subject, as only brothers can do. And the next thing he knew, he announced, in a very loud voice, that he was not going to marry Penelope Featherington. Except somehow Penelope had been standing right there in the doorway, her hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with pain and embarrassment, and probably a dozen other unpleasant emotions that he'd been too ashamed to delve into. It had been one of the most awful moments of his life. One, in fact, that he made an effort not to remember. He didn't think Penelope had ever fancied him, at least not any more than other ladies fancied him, but he'd embarrassed her. To single her out for such an announcement, it had been unforgivable. He'd apologized, of course, and she'd accepted, but he'd never quite forgiven himself. And now he'd gone and insulted her again. Not in as direct a manner, of course, but he should have thought a bit longer and harder before complaining about his life. In the book, after this, he decides to go out that night specifically to see Penelope and apologize to her because she had read him for complaining about his rich boy problems. And while reflecting on that, he is flashing back to that moment of, I would never marry Penelope, and it compounds his guilt. And I love this paralleled storytelling where both of them are haunted by that I would never marry Penelope exchange. It put them on more of an even level in the story, instead of how the show played it, where Colin had no idea he deeply hurt his friend. All the while, show Penelope is haunted by it, tormented by the memory, and a bunch of viewers are left ready to fight show Colin on Penelope's behalf. Some of the book Colin fans are directing their anger at the wrong place, in my personal opinion. Instead of having a go at the people who are or were reacting to the material exactly how it was presented in the show, maybe those folks could ask the question of why the show higher-ups decided to set Colin up to be lambasted, because I can all but guarantee some of the general audience's reaction would not have been as prickly if the show had done the I would never marry Penelope scene the way that they did it in the book. Even Luke Newton knew that the show's version of this scene was going to become a situation. Pollen fans are legion, and they are passionate, especially now. At the end of Bridgerton's second season, the Pollen story was left hanging in the balance after Penelope overheard Colin gossiping about her with other men in the town, saying that he would never court her. It was devastating, Newton says. I think we did a read-through on Zoom. There's obviously that internal conversation that goes through my head that's like, I can't say that because I know what the response is going to be. Does he actually feel that way? It's weird. There was so much going through my head. When I first read it, I was like, how am I going to live this down? Luke Newton, I really feel bad that these people set you up like this. Luke Newton knew damn well what was going to happen. And the fact that it was just swiftly glossed over on the show, you just swept that under the rug with this rushed apology in season 3, episode 1, after 2 years of Luke Newton catching strays by...
No one knows what it is. It's like this mad riddle that no one knows what it is, right?
The next bit I'm going to visit is the hand cut. In the show, you saw that Colin cut his hand and Penelope tended to his injury, and the lead up to that was her having a peek at his journal. The show presented his journals as something salacious.
In those moments alone, as my fingers trace freckles from cheek to collarbone, or as I watch the way starlight dances across skin, I marvel at how one can feel such intimacy, but also such great distance.
But in the book, however, it's nothing like that. She inched forward, decided that only counted as half a step, then inched forward again, and looked down, beginning her reading right in the middle of a sentence. in England. Here, the sand ripples between tan and white, and the consistency is so fine that it slides over a bare foot like a whisper of silk. The water is a blue unimaginable in England, aquamarine with the glint of the sun, deep cobalt when the clouds take the sky, and it is warm, surprisingly, astoundingly warm, like a bath that was heated perhaps a half an hour earlier. The waves are gentle, and they lap up on the shore with a soft rush of foam, tickling the skin and turning the perfect sand into a squishy delight that slips and slides along the toes until another wave arrives to clean up the mess. It is easy to see why this is said to be the birthplace of Aphrodite. With every step, I almost expect to see her as in Botticelli's painting, rising from the ocean, perfectly balanced on a giant shell, her long Titian hair streaming around her. If ever a perfect woman was born, surely this would be the place. I am in paradise. And yet, with every warm breeze and cloudless sky, I am reminded that this is not my home, that I was born to live my life elsewhere. This does not quell the desire, no, the compulsion to travel, to see, to meet. But it does feed a strange longing to touch a dew-dampened lawn, or feel a cool mist on one's face, or even to remember the joy of a perfect day after a week of rain. The people here can't know that joy. Their days are always perfect. Can one appreciate perfection when it is a constant in one's life? It is remarkable that I am cold. It is, of course, February, and as an Englishman, I'm quite used to a February chill, as well as that of any month with an R in its name. But I am not in England. I am in Cyprus, in the heart of the Mediterranean, and just 2 days ago, I was in Paphos, on the southwest coast of the island, where the sun is strong and the ocean salty and warm. Here, one can see the peak of Mount Olympus, still capped with snow so white one is temporarily blinded when the sun glints off of it. The climb to this altitude was treacherous, with danger lurking around more than one corner. The road is rudimentary, and along the way we met. Penelope let out a soft grunt of protest when she realized that the page ended in the middle of a sentence. Who had he met? What had happened? What danger? She stared down at the journal, absolutely dying to flip the page and see what happened next. But when she'd started reading, she had managed to justify it by telling herself she wasn't really invading Colin's privacy. He'd left the book open, after all. She was only looking at what he had left exposed. Turning the page, however, was something else altogether. She reached out, then yanked her hand back. This wasn't right. She couldn't read his journal. Well, not beyond what she'd already read. On the other hand, it was clear that these were words worth reading. It was a crime for Colin to keep them for himself. Words should be celebrated, shared. What the show has failed to convey in Season 3, Part 1, I won't comment on whether or not it's present in Part 2, is the fact that in the book, Colin and Penelope have writing in common. They bond over writing, and this is a key point in the ongoing development of Colin and Penelope's romantic relationship. This helps to escalate Colin finally seeing her in a new light. The realization was already simmering in his mind, but this shared interest helps to speed things up a bit, and in a more meaningful way. I know that there are a lot of things to be said about the appeal of Bridgerton for sultry, salacious, physical chemistry. It's part of the main love stories of each season, including Colin and Penelope's, but this is a different dimension of their relationship, and I, for one, like that there can be this multifaceted connection between them. Now, don't get me wrong, the physical connection is a fun part of the storytelling, but I would like for the well-roundedness to be there if that is in fact an option. I wish I'd known you kept a journal, Penelope said, reapplying pressure to his palm. Why? I'm not sure, she said with a shrug. It's always interesting to find out that there is more to someone than meets the eye, don't you think? Colin didn't say anything for several moments, and then quite suddenly he blurted out, "You really liked it?" She looked amused. He was horrified. Here he was, considered one of the most popular and sophisticated men of the time, and he'd been reduced to a bashful schoolboy, hanging on Penelope Featherington's every word, just for a single scrap of praise. Colin Bridgerton praise kink? Excuse me, show higher-ups, where is the Colin Bridgerton praise kink? You don't just go dangling that idea in front of me and not escalate that in live action. Are you serious? Not to mention, the whole conversation they have about his journals, it was a really fun time to read it. They talk about the flicks of his penmanship. Do you know how silly that is in the best way? Why are they not talking about the flicks of his penmanship on the show? Imagine the energy Nicola Coughlan, the iconic comedian that she is, would give to a line about pen flicks. You saw what she did with grass. What would she have done with pen flicks? Someone on her next press junket, please give her a line to read about pen flicks, purely for the laughs. And as it turns out, the people who watch my video agree that the hand-cut scene was better in the book, but will we still be be in agreement for the next moment? We're going to find out. But first, I want to remind everyone who hasn't already, please subscribe to my channel because that 30K milestone is a very important goal for me. And if we hit that, my cat Kimiko will be making an appearance on my channel in a new shirt. Also like and comment because engagement keeps the small channels afloat.
Tip your waitress.
The next big relationship moment I want to revisit is the first Colin and Penelope kiss. I'm giving this away early, but I do prefer the version in the book. My viewers disagreed, and that's okay, as long as we're all watching Bridgerton and keeping those ratings up so that the love stories keep coming. We're ultimately still on the same page. I don't think the first kiss on the show was bad. I just happen to prefer the version in the book. If I have to do a ranking, the show is second place. You still get a medal, but you don't get to stand in the middle. That's all. So let's set the scene. In the book, Lady Danbury has posed this open challenge to the Ton to figure out who Lady Whistledown is in exchange for a monetary prize. If you watched my other video about the book, you heard me share a bit from that scene. It's where she tells Penelope, I think you could be Lady Whistledown. And Penelope is all, well, I think you could be Lady Whistledown. And it's all in good fun. At that point, they haven't even revealed to the book readers that Penelope actually is in fact Lady Whistledown just yet. So in the aftermath of that challenge, Colin shows up to Penelope's house, or the Featherington house, whatever. He's there to visit Penelope, and he is all panicked because he has worked himself up into thinking that Eloise is Lady Whistledown. And it's sort of intense, but at the same time, it's a scene that's played for comedy because the tone of the scene keeps oscillating between Colin panicking that Eloise is Lady Whistledown and that this would be very bad for her, and then him being flustered about wanting to know where the food is. He's a hungry, hungry boy. He wants a tray of food. And action! Colin realized that his arms were reaching forward, and he stopped himself before he reached out to shake her shoulders. It doesn't matter. Don't you see? If someone points his finger at her, she'll be ruined. But not, Penelope said, appearing to require a great deal of effort to unclench her teeth. If she's not Lady Whistledown, how could she prove it? Colin returned, jumping to his feet. Once a rumor is started, the damage is done. It develops a life of its own. Colin, you ceased to make sense 5 minutes ago. No, hear me out. He whirled to face her, and he was seized by a feeling of such intensity that he couldn't have ripped his eyes from hers if the house were falling down around them. Suppose I told everyone that I had seduced you. Penelope grew very, very still. You would be ruined forever, he continued, crouching down near the edge of the sofa so that they were more on the same level. It wouldn't matter that we had never even kissed. That, my dear Penelope, is the power of the word. She looked oddly frozen, and at the same time flushed. I don't know what to say, she stammered. And then the most bizarre thing happened. He realized that he didn't know what to say either, because he'd forgotten about rumors and the power of the word and all of that rot. And the only thing he could think of was the part about the kissing and good God in heaven, he wanted to kiss Penelope Featherington. Penelope Featherington! He might as well have said he wanted to kiss his sister. Except, he stole a glance at her, she looked uncommonly fetching, and he wondered how he hadn't noticed that earlier that afternoon. She wasn't his sister. She definitely wasn't his sister. Colin? His name was a mere whisper on her lips. Her eyes were quite adorably blinking and befuddled. And how was it he'd never noticed what an intriguing shade of brown they were? Almost gold near the pupil. He'd never seen anything like it, and yet it wasn't as if he hadn't seen her 100 times before. He stood, suddenly, drunkenly. Best if they weren't quite on the same latitude. Harder to see her eyes from up here. She stood too. Damn it. Colin? She asked, her voice barely audible. Could I ask you a favor? Call it male intuition. Call it insanity. But a very insistent voice inside of him was screaming that whatever she wanted had to be a very bad idea. He was, however, an idiot. He had to be, because he felt his lips part and then he heard a voice that sounded an awful lot like his own say, of course. Her lips puckered, and for a moment he thought she was trying to kiss him, but then he realized that she was just bringing them together to form a word. Would, just a word, nothing but a word beginning with W. W always looked like a kiss. Would you kiss me? I'm sorry, but I'm not sorry to my viewers who voted in that poll. It's fine if you prefer the show version over the book. That's okay, because now you have two versions of the first Paul and Kiss, and that's not even including the who knows how many fics there are all over the internet, but I still prefer the book version. For one, Colin in the show wasn't thinking about kissing her until Penelope asked. In the book, the thought is already in his head when she asks him. That means there's a mutual vibe. The vibes are flowing.
So what? Flow is flow.
Also, the first kiss in the show, the vibes have this gloomy cloud overshadowing what should be a fun, exciting moment. You've waited 3 seasons, or I suppose it's technically 2 1/4 by the time you get to this specific scene, and they had to go and add all this extra drama that they did not need. I don't like seeing Penelope upset more than she needs to be. It's Nicola's turn to be the main girl. I want her having a good time. Penelope season, first kiss from Mr. No Thoughts Head Empty. I don't want her being all full of despair from the humiliation of your help me find a husband scheme being exposed to the Ton. The show lifted many of the lines from the book to the show for this first kiss scene, and that is cute and fun to give that wink and a nod to the source material, but the larger tone is vastly different. Penelope still does the whole I could die thing, but it doesn't feel as full of anguish in the book the way that it plays out in the show. Listen, Nicola Coughlan is a great actress. We know this. I don't doubt her capabilities at delivering these lines like it's this big dramatic monologue. I just like the vibe of the scene in the book more. Not to mention, the first kiss goes on for much longer in the book than it did in the show. In the show, they do a little bit, and then they pause, and then they move back into it, and then Penelope thanks him, and she leaves. The first kiss in the book, I don't want to read the full excerpt since I don't know whether YouTube will like it if I do that, but I will simply say that it keeps going. Colin's hands wanders somewhere, peach emoji. And we can all talk about how they went out of their way to take so many quotes from the book, but they didn't keep Colin telling her, you can kiss me too. A kiss is for 2 people. You changed Colin's material in the show to give him this whole I'm going to teach you lessons storyline, which wasn't in the book, by the way. But then you didn't even keep the lines, you can kiss me too, and a kiss is for 2 people. What are we doing here? I'm just saying, if I was a producer for promotional material for this season, I would have orchestrated some sort of segment to have Luke Newton recite that line, because I find it to be a peculiar choice to omit that line, and I think the people at large would have had a whole lot of fun feelings if he had in fact said that line. Now, of course, the last major relationship moment I'm going to cover in this video, somewhat, is the carriage scene. Now, if we're speaking purely about physical actions, I don't have an issue with the carriage scene on the show. My viewers who voted in the poll, they chose the show option, and I'm going to have to give it to the book again, though. But where the show and the book differ significantly in regards to the carriage scene is the entire lead up to it. If I could hone in on a more specific excerpt to read, I would do that, but the context of the lead up to the carriage scene spans so many pages that I just could not find a bit that would efficiently convey what I would want to relay about how the carriage scene is different from the show. The short explanation is that Colin already knows that Penelope is Lady Whistledown before they get physical in the carriage, but I'm going to try to talk you through some of the buildup if you haven't read it already. Colin goes to visit Penelope, but he spots her getting into a strange carriage that he doesn't recognize. It's a different carriage that she got specifically to go into the city without being recognized for using one of the Featherington family carriages. He follows her, like Joe Goldberg follows her, all the way to her destination. She goes into a church that has a designated drop-off location where she's going to leave a new Lady Whistledown newsletter for her collaborator to come pick up for publishing. Colin pops up like a K-drama villain, surprise, to catch her. You know, I almost did a cutaway for that, a Vincenzo cutaway, but I decided not to do that because that was a really good reveal, and you should just watch Vincenzo if you haven't already. Don't look up spoilers, just watch it and experience that roller coaster for yourself. Watch Vincenzo and try to tell me that Netflix isn't delusional for not giving Bridgerton more episodes per season and releasing them weekly. Anyway, what were we on about? Colin Bridgerton pops up, he catches Penelope, and he's all riled up because he doesn't like the idea of her having a secret when she's privy to so much about him. He's let her see his journal. This is after the hand cut scene has taken place. He's also jealous because he doesn't know if her secret is that she has a lover on the side. He's just upset in general. He doesn't know what's going on with himself emotionally. A lot of feelings are happening. And he rips open the envelope. He saw her trying to sneak into the hiding spot, and that is how he discovers Penelope Featherington is Lady Whistledown. Then she runs out. She wants to get back into her rented carriage, but that carriage has left her, so he gets a carriage. I don't know how ordering a carriage works in ye olden times, but let's just presume it's the Regency version of hailing a taxi, but with more space and less visibility between the passengers and the driver.
Keep gliding. Keep gliding. I'm gliding here.
What are you, blind?
Now, the general impression I got from the folks who not only voted in the poll but elaborated on their takes in the comments of that poll is that those readers did not like that Colin was angry, and they didn't like him getting physical with Penelope. Not that type of physical, but the bad kind of physical. So that brings me to an excerpt that I can very easily share. First of all, he said, the terribly even tone of his voice suggesting that he was trying very hard to keep his temper in check. And this was, in and of itself, rather disturbing, as she hadn't been aware that Colin even possessed a temper. I cannot believe you were stupid enough to venture into the city by yourself, and in a hired hack, no less. I could hardly go by myself in one of our own carriages, Penelope blurted out before she remembered that she'd meant to remain silent. His head moved about an inch to the left. She didn't know what that meant, but she couldn't imagine it was good, especially since it almost seemed as if his neck were tightening as it twisted. I beg your pardon? He asked, his voice still that awful blend of satin and steel. Well, now she had to answer, didn't she? It's nothing, she said, hoping the evasion would reduce his attention on the rest of her reply. Just that I'm not allowed to go out by myself. I am aware of that, he bit off. There's a damned good reason for it, too. So, if I wanted to go out by myself, she continued, choosing to ignore the second part of his reply, I couldn't very well use one of our carriages. None of our drivers would agree to take me here. Your drivers, he snapped, are clearly men of impeccable wisdom and sense. Penelope said nothing. Do you have any idea what could have happened to you? He demanded, his sharp mask of control beginning to crack. Very little, actually, she said, gulping on the sentence. I've come here before and— What? His hand closed over her upper arm with painful force. What did you just say? Repeating it seemed almost dangerous to her health, so Penelope just stared at him, hoping that maybe she could break through the wild anger in his eyes and find the man she knew and loved so dearly. It's only when I need to leave an urgent message for my publisher, she explained. I send a coded messenger, then he knows to pick up my note here. Now, put a pin in this because I am going to continue this train of thought, addressing the fact that people don't like that Colin is angry and that he grabbed her, but I want to first say that after the excerpt I just shared, Colin and Penelope proceed to have an extremely long, in-depth conversation. They cover so many different facets of their relationship. This big revelation about her being Lady Whistledown, it's very thorough. To give you an idea of what this conversation is, if it had been up to me, I would have made this entire revelation one episode. And not only that, I would have made it an episode that was just Colin and Penelope. No other characters, no other side plots. And I say that as a Benedict girly. His storyline in part 1 wasn't doing it for me anyway. Does it get better in part 2? I couldn't say, literally, because I will get an angry email from Netflix if I do. If it were up to me, I would have probably started this episode with him deciding to go visit Penelope, following her downtown, confronting her to uncover what she's up to. They get in the carriage, and then they just sit and talk. It would have been this really bold experimental choice where even though the show has been established as an ensemble show, this is simply too big in their story to not be thorough. They need to talk this out. That's how much material is in the book. You could make this its own episode. And if you check the page count of your script and there's still room to check in on other storylines, then fine, you can add some of those back in. But then after all of that talking and digging through the layers of the ripple effects of this revelation, then you do the salacious part of the carriage ride. That would be the climax of the episode.
Nymphoid mania.
As a reminder though, if you didn't watch my previous video about the book, this carriage ride, and moreover the Lady Whistledown revelation to Colin specifically, this happens about midway through the story. At the time of me publishing this video, you have seen half of season 3. You got the salacious part of the carriage ride, but Colin still doesn't know that Penelope is Lady Whistledown. In the book, Colin does propose to Penelope after the salacious ongoings in the carriage, and they've arrived back at her place. The quote is basically copy and paste from the book into the show.
Your family will see me.
For God's sake, Penelope Featherington, are you going to marry me or not?
But Colin proposing in the book emotionally resonates differently because not only does he know that she's Lady Whistledown, they've had this extremely long, thorough conversation going through everything that they needed to go through. Really, if you want to fully understand the context, I would just tell you to go look up this chapter of the book or pop on over to your local library and get to that chapter. Actually, it's more than one chapter. So when I say I prefer the carriage scene in the book, the physical hookup is a much smaller percentage of what I like about where we're at in the story at that point than how the carriage scene is being regarded within the show's narrative. When it comes to Bridgerton, I prefer the explicit scenes that have a lot more build up to them than the show has given to Colin and Penelope in what's supposed to be their own season. Now, it's not a bad hookup, but when I watched my press screeners for the first time, I felt like I wanted them to have had more conversations with each other before we got to this steamy hookup. And then when I went and read the book, and this book had an extremely long conversation that covers a lot of ground in their relationship, I was confused as to why it wasn't in the show. Okay, now let's circle back to that point I said we were going to put a pin in. There are readers who do not like that Colin has more instances of becoming angry in his book, and the way that he expresses his anger in the book compared to how he is characterized on the show, and they don't like that he grabbed her. I completely agree. Don't do that.
Maybe you can bully some of the chicks in this school, but this chick has been bullied by one Johnny Nagarelli for the last time.
But I do want to share just a couple of things for further context, particularly if you're watching my videos and you have not read the book, since every time I've done these polls, there are at least 1,000 people voting each time for the option that says you haven't read the book. Number one, I had to look up when this book was published because I did have a vague recollection that quite a few of these books were published a while back, but I didn't remember the exact timeline. This book, Romancing Mr. Bridgerton, was published in 2002. That means this book is a period piece twice over. It's not only set in the Regency era, this book was written and published over 20 years ago. If you were not alive in the early 2000s, or you were not old enough to have a grasp on the social norms of that time period, you at least have the option to watch films from the early 2000s and observe what was considered to be normal, or at least acceptable enough to be allowed to be mass-produced and distributed as entertainment to the public at large. I am not excusing his behavior, but does it make sense why book Colin is not always behaving in a way that is enticing to a forward-thinking 2024 audience with a proclivity for romantic fiction? Yes. I was just recently watching You've Got Mail, and I didn't like it. Tom Hanks' character, the male romantic lead, he gave me a massive case of the ick. People love to hype up Nora Ephron's rom-coms that star Meg Ryan, and they just don't do it for me. That one came out in 1998, so a couple of years before Romancing Mr. Bridgerton. At this point, it's practically a lifetime ago. So when I saw that Romancing Mr. Bridgerton was published in 2002, I went, okay, I don't like this behavior, but the things that work in the book work well enough that I'm willing to tip the scale towards more so rating the book with a thumbs up than I would a thumbs down. Colin's anger and him grabbing Penelope, that's a very easy thing to just throw out the window when you are brainstorming adapting the book material into live action. The important parts of the plot are not dependent on those more unsavory moments of him being too angry. And the second point of context I want to provide is another book excerpt from Romancing Mr. Bridgerton. This is from Penelope's point of view. This is from much earlier on in the book. It's far before the carriage scene. One thing she did know, however, and should have remembered, was that if Colin had any sort of a temper, he had never chosen to let her see it. Surely she'd flattered herself when she thought that her little quip about his brothers marrying before they turned 30 might set him off. No, his method of attack was a lazy smile, a well-timed joke. If Colin ever lost his temper, Penelope shook her head slightly, unable to even fathom it. Colin would never lose his temper, at least not in front of her. He'd have to be really, truly, no, profoundly upset to lose his temper. And that kind of fury could only be sparked by someone you really, truly, profoundly cared about. Colin liked her well enough, maybe even better than he liked most people, but he didn't care, not that way. Now, obviously, I don't love the idea of perpetuating the train of thought that seeing a man get angry at you is anything but a sign to run far away, but with this excerpt, we can gain more clarity about what the authorial, as well as the larger cultural rhetoric of that time period was. This is a window into what the story believes is the function of Colin's anger. This excerpt claims that if Colin loses his temper in front of her, that it can only be because he's upset over something to do with someone he really, truly, profoundly cares about. So, when he's getting angry at Penelope in the carriage, he's already angry about the secrecy of her being Lady Whistledown, but more specifically, it's when they're discussing the fact that she goes into the city alone and in a carriage that she's hired that isn't part of her family's regular staff, and she says that she's done this plenty of times before. So what the story is attempting to do is communicate, oh, he's only angry because he cares about her safety. He cares about her, he's worried that something bad could have have happened to her by doing this. I think there are much better ways to communicate that point without getting grabby in a way that is physically painful. But at least with this excerpt, we basically have a cheat code to translate 2002 speak to 2024 speak. I don't like that they've dragged out the Lady Whistledown reveal on the show. Whether or not you choose to have others learn about the truth, that can be discussed at a later time. But at the very least, in a pollen season, you needed to have him learn about this earlier, and definitely before a proposal. I'm not entirely opposed to the idea of there being some amount of physical connection before he finds out that she's Lady Whistledown, if that's really what you want to do with the story, because you could at least more easily make a case for Penelope not having revealed it yet because it's such a massive secret. But to hit the halfway point and still not have Colin know, I don't like that. I want Colin and Penelope to talk to each other. It's Bridgerton, so of course they're going to have the NSFW stuff too, but this is a massive step forward for them in their developing relationship, and both the carriage hookup and the proposal are significantly more satisfying for me after you've had them talk everything out with one another. Honestly, my number one issue with season 3 part 1 is that I wanted to see more pollen conversations than what was presented in those first 4 episodes. Proportionate to the already too short runtime and too short episode count, I just needed a lot more of them talking to each other about everything. Themselves, their hopes, their dreams, life, the world, their relationship, all of that. Nicola Coughlan and Luke Newton have a very nice chemistry, and every time I'm feeling the vibes between their characters, I feel like we don't get to stay with them in those moments for long enough. I've seen some comments on my videos saying that they don't buy the chemistry, but if that's your opinion, that's your opinion. I personally happen to like their chemistry. I just wanted to see more of it. For me specifically, I just wanted to see more of this.
Why are you leaving so soon? Especially in such a charming dress.
Do not mock me, please.
Mock you? I assure you I'm quite serious. The colour rather suits you. Do you not need a chaperone?
Spinsters do not need chaperones.
You are not a spinster. I was assaulted by a devilishly yellow head covering.
It was not my fault the wind blew clean off my head. Yet somehow they shine even brighter when you are kind. I might say something like that if you were a suitor.
Well, that was rather direct. You are joking.
I am not. Colin!
Forgive me. I did not know. Surely someone here is not in mourning? We shall gallop along.
Colin!
And I apologise.
I apologise for asking.
I do not apologise.
You apologise?
Yes, but I... Yes.
Do I have sugar on my face?
No. You removed it.